Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, a digital space where we explore the Catholic intellectual tradition. I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy, and I'm joined this week by my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy for Catholic Studies Academy. Today we'll be talking about the issue of political alignment, which we've gotten used to thinking about in terms of left and right. Dr. Smith, you've done quite a lot of work in political philosophy over the course of your career. Your book, Understanding Modern Political Ideas from St. John Books, could really be a help to people in an election year. But you might suggest that in any event, our categories of left and right might be too simplistic at this point in history.
Mm.
And to many people, political alignment appears to happen almost at random. Why one
Sure.
person falls on the left and another person on the right, nobody seems to know. And a person's religious affiliation doesn't seem to have very much to do with it. Why don't you
Mm.
help us out with this?
Sure. Yeah. So, let's start with a little bit of background. I think, really what we need more than anything else, just some clarifications about left and right. Um, just sort of kind of play it out and look at sort of the varieties, I think, that can be at play. It's helpful, especially as Americans, I think, to look both at our own sort of political history, but also at the broader sort of uh, history of these alignments in Europe, right? Because
Hmm.
this language, left and right, really comes from European political history, right? Anybody who's done any work in political theory or political philosophy is going to know that left and right really comes from the assembly during the French Revolution, right? And what it denoted was it's interesting, right? So I forget exactly what's called, like the Hall of Deputies or something like that, but there's an assembly, right, of the estates, right?
Uh-huh.
And this assembly eventually became pretty revolutionary with respect to the French monarchy. The estates were something that could gather, and I don't remember all the exact historical details about uh, exactly each of their gatherings, but over time they were allowed to gather, and they started to gather though even in times where they weren't allowed to gather, and sort of um, developed an agenda, right, that sort of eventually led to the French Revolution.
Hmm.
Both before and during the French Revolution, right? Um, the that assembly, the estates, could be divided into literally left and right. Okay,
Uh-huh.
and those on the who sat on the left were tended to be the more radical of the group, right?
Hmm.
That is, they were the what we would call sort of the Jacobins, right?
Uh-huh.
Or associated with the Jacobins, not to be confused with Jacobites,
Right,
which are a
right.
very
Totally
different
different
group,
thing.
okay?
Yeah.
But the Jacobins, and then on the right were people. This is interesting, who weren't necessarily hardcore monarchists, but were moderates, right?
Hmm.
They wanted to maybe reform the monarchy, right? That sort of thing, right? Now, over time, the moderates lost and lost hard,
Uh-huh.
right? To the Jacobins. In fact, during the I forget what it's called, something like the Purge or something, but there's a period during the Revolution, the French Revolution, where they just start killing like their own, right?
Uh-huh.
As happens sometimes in revolutionary
Yeah.
movements,
Pretty much
right?
every time.
Right.
Almost every time.
So, yeah, right. So, the uh, that language comes from there. Now, let me provide a little broader context. The French Revolution was not totally unique, right? This is the period of the Enlightenment. There's a lot of revolution in the air, right?
Hmm.
And it's interesting to think, when they overthrow the monarchy, they set the goddess reason, right, as their, in the cathedral, right, Notre Dame. I don't know if it was in the cathedral or in front, but it was there and put there symbolically, right, as an
Uh-huh.
important, sort of a symbol. Um, the like I said, the old French monarchical relics had to be saved, right? They were trying to burn. I mean, people forget how just violent
Hmm.
and anti-Catholic the French Revolution really was.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of that in the Enlightenment, right?
Hmm.
And you know what we have come to call classical liberalism, right, was very much in the air, right? Now we tend to be most familiar with a kind of English version of classical liberalism,
Right.
right?
Right.
That flows out of John Locke. Now we shouldn't think that it doesn't have a hard edge, right?
Hmm.
It tends to be a little less radical than, say, the continental versions of liberalism. But you know, it still had an edge. I mean, it helped justify the Glorious Revolution, right, in England and depose James II. It
Hmm.
helped justify the American Revolution, right? You could have sort of debates about how much, but still, it was in play, right, in the rhetoric and debates of the time. Um, but so there's a commonality, right, really in the Enlightenment with liberalism, right, across sort of Europe. Again, there's different strains, but there's the a strong emphasis on the individual and individual liberty, especially in the continental section, and equality, right? So the equality of human beings and the individuality of human beings, right, and their
Hmm.
individual rights, proposed against the ancient the ancient regime, right?
Right.
So you have like the ancient regime. Sometimes this is misunderstood. It's not as if there were no limits on the ancient regime, say in France or in England. There were limits, but they weren't usually articulated in the vocabulary of individual rights.
Right. Right.
You know, and there was, to be sure, a much a broad view, I'd say, of the powers appropriate to the crown,
Yeah.
right? Up to and including religious powers, right?
Hmm.
That is that even after the Protestant Reformation, many regimes, whether Catholic or Protestant, outlawed heresy as they understood it,
Right. Right.
in a pretty straightforward way. Even if they started to move away from outright persecution, there was still discrimination for sure, right? They say if you were an Irish Catholic in England, that was certainly, you couldn't hold certain posts, all that kind of
Right.
things, right?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
We still saw much of that in the United States too, right? Like
Sure. Yeah.
after our Constitution, right? The idea of the First Amendment, religious liberty, um,
Mm.
applying at the state and local level was that was not an original concept, right?
That's right. That's true. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. In
It was
fact,
written
even
into
as
many
much
of the
as the
state
Enlightenment
constitutions that
rejected
Catholics couldn't
revealed,
hold office, or that you had to be a Baptist or something, right, to
right.
hold
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
public office.
Absolutely. So even as much as the Enlightenment sort of rejected, like sort of tended to reject revealed religion, right? It still
Yeah.
kind of looked askance at atheism. Um, but so the idea of what I would call a confessionalism or establishment
Hmm.
was very much part of the pre-modern, pre-liberal regime, right?
Hmm.
So with the advent of liberalism, right? There's this to say, emphasis on individual liberty and equality that works itself out in different ways in different places in Europe. But it can be more or less radical, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
Um, in its most radical form, right? You end up with something that's wants to remove religion mostly or entirely from the public square and wants to leave at its extreme end, say someone like Thomas Paine, wants to leave all questions open to the individual and all actions open to the individual that do not impede on the individual liberty or equality of someone else,
Yeah.
right? So there is a limit, but the limit is itself individual liberty and equality.
Hmm.
Right. Now, of course, this was unevenly applied, right, in terms of sex and race, but that was still the ideal, right?
Right. Right.
Um, Now, the prior regime, as I say, had limits, but they weren't articulated in that way. And I think, to be honest, they had broader powers in some ways, right, than the ideals, at least, of the liberal
Yeah.
regime.
So that's true.
Mm,
But one of the things that I often emphasize with people when I talk about concepts, for example, like the divine right of kings, okay,
mm,
um, is that it really originally that concept was about limitation rather than just sort of tyranny.
sure.
You know, we have this kind of distorted view from an American perspective on the divine right of kings because we associate it with tyrannical moves on the part of kings in the post Henry VIII period leading up to, you
Uh,
know, the kind of what appeared to Americans as total despotism toward the colonies, right, under George
mm.
III. And all justified by, hey, I'm the king. Okay. You know, but in the Middle Ages, that wasn't really the way they thought about it. Kings couldn't do whatever they wanted.
They couldn't do whatever they wanted. They could do a lot, though. I mean, they could still, order you to be executed for heresy.
Yeah,
Uh,
they could, but you know, at least that is enforcing a church law. But what they couldn't really do
hmm.
is just oppose the church, right? Turn over the church.
Well, they weren't
Uh,
supposed to.
they're not
Uh,
supposed to. Yeah, so
yeah, I mean, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Thomas of Becket got on the wrong side of that one.
yeah,
Uh,
right, right, right,
and in the
right.
end, even though you know, in the end, the king kind of won. I mean, he got the secular courts had the right to try the clerics in England.
Uh,
Um, Albeit he had to do public penance, which I'm sure was very embarrassing.
yeah,
Can't imagine a more modern leader having to do public penance, right?
that'd be
Um,
nice though.
that's right. And of course, all these places had laws against things like we'll just call them sexual indecency,
Right.
um, for sure, right?
Hmm.
Even things like people who committed suicide weren't buried in decent burial grounds, right? Because considered self-murder. I mean, it's
Yeah,
very different. Adultery was a not a civil matter; it was a criminal
yeah.
matter, right?
Even in the United States, through much of the 20th century, it was still like a felony in most states.
There you go, right? Whole
Um,
different world, right?
maybe we should go back to that. I don't know. That's a whole different discussion, I guess.
So
Um,
the alignments, I think, come out of that, right? That is the reaction to liberalism, right?
mhm,
I think it's hard for us to wrap our mind around the idea that for most of history, the idea that you could separate what I would call a strong substantive commitment philosophically and morally from politics was completely foreign to people, right?
mhm,
What do I mean? I mean, like this in ancient Greece, for example, right? You could be tried, executed, or exiled for defacing public statues,
mhm.
right? That right statues to either heroes or the gods, right? Because it was considered a sacrilege. Like sacrilege was a crime, right?
Yeah,
That they took very seriously because they had a substantive view of morality in the world and thought that that should be part of politics. Do you follow me?
yeah. I think
Right.
I'm so, you know, there's also, I think, a sense that the cohesion of the society, right,
Mhm.
rests upon accepting, like receiving this
Sure.
tradition, right? Sharing
Yes.
a common, these are good things and these are bad things.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And we see that together and we want to play it out together. So whether you look at like ancient China and Confucianism to ancient Greece to Rome, um, all the way through the medieval period, right? You have a society that's committed to a substantive view, right? That is a strong, robust account of morality and metaphysics, right? The world, right?
Yeah.
That is, and the good, right? In the strong, sort of Platonic sense, right?
Hmm.
That needs to not only be recognized, but played out and um, instantiated in social and political practice, right? Do you follow me?
Yeah.
Right. Of course, there's different accounts of that, but the idea that there is the good and that we know what
Hmm.
the good is and that needs to be expressed within politics, right? Was the common view of humanity, right, throughout the world, right? until this weird period of the Enlightenment, where you have this advent of liberalism, which basically says, no, right? We live the big question of the good up to the individual, right? And politics is going to kind of stay out of that as much as possible. And what we're going to do is we're going to establish procedures of fair play, procedures that respect everybody's individuality and equality, right? But we're going to leave people alone to make up their own account of the good. There's a famous Supreme Court case. You'll probably remember it, Rich.
Yeah.
Maybe Casey versus Planned Parenthood,
Uh-huh.
where one of the justices, says this is the heart of liberty, right?
Yeah.
That we have the ability to conceive for ourselves, right? The meaning and purpose of the world and existence and life, right? Former societies did not believe that, right? They
Yeah.
believed that they had received a tradition of meaning and purpose, right? And that tradition of meaning and purpose needed to be lived out in politics. That's what I'd call the ancien regime in the
Yeah.
broad sense, right?
Right.
Not just
So that
one.
would be what you're describing is, at least in the way that you defined it here, would be common to virtually every culture on Earth.
Yeah, right.
Now, obviously, the particulars will vary from one culture to the
And
next,
very
right?
importantly,
This
right?
culture is a different culture. They have a
Sure.
different view of the good,
Right.
but they still belong to the ancien regime in the sense that
Right.
they agree with us that there is such a thing
Right.
and that it needs to be politically instantiated.
That's right. That's right. Even up to and including the use of force. And that has to be just sort of, I think, accepted, like be looked at squarely, and
Right.
that
It's part of the view. Yeah.
that's part of the view, right? Liberalism rejects that, right?
Hmm.
Now, um, once liberalism sort of comes on the scene, right? That so we can divide though. So how do we come back to our issues of right and left? Well, the left, I think, wants to do that strongly, radically, consistently, right?
Uh-huh.
The right, as it was originally developed, tends to want to be inconsistently liberal.
Uh-huh.
Maybe it's one way of putting it. That is, but this is actually maybe not a bad inconsistency. That is, they want to grant, um,
Latitude, right?
yeah, the legitimacy, I guess, of certain
Mm.
liberal insights or claims,
Uh-huh.
but they want to sort of bracket it with enough of the old view, right,
Hmm.
to keep it sort of within the guardrails,
Yeah.
right?
I kind of think that that's what the framers in the US had in mind.
Probably, yeah.
I could be
It's
wrong, but like I kind of think that they're very different, as you pointed out earlier, right? From the French Revolution. That's a completely different, th those are two really different flavors, right?
they're very different
Um,
flavors. Yeah, I agree.
and because, in the United States, they originally they weren't sort of it wasn't a revolution in the sense that they wanted to overthrow what it meant to be an Englishman,
Not entirely.
right?
Yeah, I agree.
They 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 felt
English
that
without the crown.
they were entitled to certain things
Sure,
as Englishmen
sure.
that they weren't being given,
Yeah, I
right?
agree
So
with
they were
that.
kind of staking the claim that they thought they had a right to, given
Right,
the, common law and all this other stuff.
sure.
So
They
they
weren't
tried to create,
anti-religious at all.
I'm sorry?
They weren't anti-religious at
Right,
all.
they're not anti-religious, right?
Right,
Um, so they tried to create a framework that they thought was more suited, right,
right,
better suited to provide those things.
sure. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think when you have this sort of moderate liberalism,
uh-huh,
right, which I know it sounds weird to talk about the right as moderate liberal,
uh-huh,
but I hope everybody gets the historical context here. Um, this works decently well, especially when there's still a commitment to the good that's informal, right?
yeah,
And almost unspoken and
hmm,
by consensus, where there's a large degree, I'll just go ahead and say it, of demographic cultural unity,
yeah,
right? Such that you don't have to enforce decency laws because everybody agrees on what's decent.
right,
Do you follow, right? And so you get some of the advantage of the ancient regime, right? Because you still have a common cohesion of the
hmm,
good, but you can have some room for some amount of liberalism. Now, I actually think that over time that doesn't work. I think
Yeah.
liberalism undermines those informal um, remains
Yeah,
of
I
the
think
HER
you're
regime.
right. I think you're right, I'm sad to say.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that Friedrich Nietzsche kind of recognized that, right?
Right.
I mean, like in the aphorism about the madman,
Mhm.
uh, I mean, it's one of those things. There are maybe two passages in Nietzsche I could think of that like every human being on the planet should read. But one is the madman,
Uh,
and the other is Out of Service, right? From Thus Spoke Zarathustra, about the
okay.
last pope.
Uh,
Th those two things are, I think, those are must-read passages in Nietzsche. I'm not endorsing Nietzsche, but I'm just saying he's right about some things.
sure.
His social
Insightful.
criticism is kind of on
Mhm.
target. One of the things that I find in that aphorism about the madman is this idea that people have embraced a worldview that actually is um, preclusive of belief in God,
Right.
and and they're riding the coattails of a culture that
Uh,
believed in God. And they
sure.
have yet to come to grips with the fact, with the implications, right, of disbelief. Where is
Mhm.
it going to lead?
Right.
They're comfortable in their current condition. They don't see where it ends,
Right.
and they're not prepared for where they're going to end up
Mhm.
when it all falls apart, which Nietzsche sees as inevitable,
Sure.
right? That's what I think he's basically saying in that aphorism.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah. There's, yeah, you've adopted, as you say, premises that lead like in this direction, right? Even though you haven't quite realized it yet. And I think, sort of the liberal practice over time, the individuality. I mean, over time, you're going to introduce more diversity, right? That's going to tend
Uh-huh.
to undermine that unity that's sort of unspoken. Um, and I think there's the practice of debate and all that sort of thing that goes on. And then the practical politics of putting together a several factions, and you
Yeah.
have to kind of pay those factions off and all that sort of politicking.
And they
I
all
think
have their distinct interests.
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Ends up undermining, right, that the remains of the ancient regime. But I think hopefully this has given us some ways of thinking about this, right? Right. So again, there's the view of the good. The ancient regime thinks that needs to be instantiated in politics.
Hmm.
Liberalism says no, right? But then we have two sort of branches of liberalism: a right version, which is moderately liberal, so it wants to hold on to some of the ancient regime,
Yeah.
and then the left, which wants to hold on to none of the ancient regime, right?
Right.
Now, I would distinguish um, two versions really of the left, right?
Okay. Yeah.
I would say that there's um, a moderate indifferent left as politics developed afterwards, okay?
Hmm.
And what I would call the revolutionary left, right?
All right. Yeah.
All right, the revolutionary left is really, in my view, the true left, right?
Hmm.
In the strongest sense. That is, they see the Haitian regime. So this is interesting how it develops. Liberalism wants to reject the good, right? The old way, um, at least in politics, right? And leave that all open. Um, so a true liberal will want to say something like politics needs to be God-free
Hmm.
and and morally minimal, right? Right. So that would be your left that wants to just kind of make things sort of procedural, right?
Yeah.
As much as possible, right? Sort of you can worship God at home, but don't bring God into the workplace,
Hmm.
that kind of thing, right? Or you want to object to abortion or gay marriage, do that in your family, don't bring it into the public square, right? That kind of thing, right? We want to leave that space as open as possible. That's one kind of left, what I might call the moderate left, center left.
Yeah.
A further view, though, right, which is really like the revolutionary left, is it's like the Jacobins, right?
Hmm.
We don't want to just not have the king in our business. We want to kill the king,
Hmm.
right? We want to desecrate the relics and Saint Denis, right? Saint Denis, right? We want to execute nuns and priests, right? We want to get rid of the Catholic religion.
Yeah.
Okay. That
Because
was the real Jacobin
its sheer
agenda.
existence is a threat
It's a
because it
threat.
testifies against
That's
this
right.
view, right?
Yeah. And the funny thing is, on the far left, they do actually, in an odd sort of way, reintroduce morality. It's just a different
Oh
morality,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, and so, which is kind of an internal contradiction, but
Oh,
they
so this is
perceive that
actually,
way.
yeah, so this is I did want to talk about this. Like I don't want to derail your thought, but I just
Yeah.
want to make this comment that um it's sort of impossible ultimately to completely get rid of the idea of l'Ancien regime, right? Because
I agree, actually.
yeah, because you're going to cohere around some common thing, right?
Yes, yes,
And in this
yeah,
case, it's radical secularism, right?
right.
And so the perpetuation of the idea of revolution.
Uh,
You notice, right, with certain societies, they continue to talk about the revolution 50 years in.
that's right.
Um, and that's all part of this thing, right? The revolution itself is the value.
That's right. Yeah, yeah,
All right, so go on.
yeah. I agree totally. And that there is, I think, in liberalism. So it's interesting, Rich. Some left critics. I'm thinking
Hmm.
about somebody like Herbert Marcuse, right? Um, would claim that liberalism all along was a lie, right?
Uh-huh.
That it was always just a different set of aristocrats or oligarchs behind the
Hmm.
scene, right? So we get rid of the old aristocrats, but we just bring in a new group of aristocrats,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Namely the capitalists, right? And so, yeah, it's a liberal democracy run by capitalism, right?
Hmm.
And I will say to some degree, I kind of think there's a little bit of truth to that. That is, I don't think that liberalism was ever pure, right? Kind of for the reason you're saying.
In the fallen world, like not a lot is.
Well, that's true, but yeah, kind of like for the reason you're saying. At some point, there's going to be some substantive beliefs,
Yeah.
right,
You
that
can't
enter
live without them.
into the social and political life.
So I
Even
mean,
if you're
take
not
it.
able to see them, they look neutral to you, right? But
Yeah.
think about, say, like how much we value the university or used to value the university and university education. That's a very particular view about the
Hmm.
world, about the value of knowledge, right?
Yeah.
That we should have scholars who spend enormous amounts of time, right, learning languages and all. I mean, there's a lot of substantive commitments behind that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, to take a Thomistic insight here, right?
Mm.
No one acts without an end.
Sure, right.
Okay. So there would be no cohesive action. There'd be no, the revolution would never be one thing. It
Right.
would never be able to agree to overthrow something, right?
That's right.
Unless there was some shared view.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. So I think there's a sense in which the what I would call sort of the far left, they tend to gather around, um, you know, different things. I could say Marxism, right? Would be an example of this. Um, Extreme views of equality,
Hmm.
extreme views about uh, freedom. You always have to remember that Marx believed that the ultimate goal of Marxism was, this kind of transformation of the human person into post-capitalist man, um, such that he would be able to achieve complete freedom in realizing his freedom and creativity.
Uh-huh.
Um, the It didn't work out that way, but
Yeah. I mean,
anyways,
it sounds nice.
it does. Sounds good. Yeah, it sounds good. So there's that kind of thing,
Uh,
you know. Yeah, so usually the coalesces around extreme versions of equality or extreme
mhm.
accounts of freedom that are flawed, right? But still, you can see in the background, so as flawed as Marx is, he's still appealing to freedom,
Right.
right?
Right.
We think he's wrong about it,
Uh-huh.
but there's still that little bit of like enlightenment in the background, right?
Yeah, and
Um,
a world governed by reason rather than faith.
oh, for sure, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, a certain kind of reason, a very secular materialist reason, but yeah,
Right, but
yeah,
once you've cast, I mean, what option do you ultimately have left, right? Once you've cast the church as part of the problem, once you've
Yeah,
cast religious belief as superstition,
yeah, yeah,
of course you're going to end up
yeah,
in
yeah,
that spot.
sure, yeah. So that allows me to think about the left. So we go back to the right side here. So we have the moderate right,
Uh-huh.
right, which wants to kind of mix, right, liberalism and the ancient regime. I think the stronger right, right, or the farther right, you might call it the extreme right. I hate using that phrase because it gets used all the time of
Okay, well,
anybody.
go ahead and use it, but
Yeah,
let's define it so that we
sure.
actually know what it should mean.
Yeah.
And this way, when people hear it thrown around in the media, they can say, is that actually what they believe? Because I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
You
that's
know,
right.
all right.
So a far right, but somebody who's on the far right, in my view, is someone who either is a reactionary or somebody who wants to develop a new version of the ancient regime, right?
Uh-huh.
So somebody like a true reactionary, right, would be say the peasants of the Vendée, right, along with the aristocrats who tried to rebel against the revolutionary government,
Hmm.
right, in France, right. The Cristeros in Mexico would be reactionaries, right. The Jacobites in Scotland would be reactionaries. I would say yeah. So those would be those are people who are trying to reestablish in some way or the other the ancient regime, right?
Right.
Um, that would be sort of the reactionary version. Or you could be for trying to have some newer version of the ancient regime that's not just a return, but maybe sort of accepts modernity. No, sorry, accepts at least that we have to have a new version, right? So maybe we're not going
Uh-huh.
to have anointed kings, but we're going to have sort of a substantive commitment to the good that's played out within the political world, right?
Right.
Um,
So, so maybe you would have a written constitution and maybe you would have some sort of parliamentary representative system of government, right?
Perhaps, yeah,
You might,
yeah,
instead of just reestablishing a monarchy, right?
sure,
Um, so that it would still kind of look more modern and people would have
right,
kind of say in government, but you would define, say, within your written constitution parameters that excluded certain beliefs about the good that were incompatible with
right.
the culture you wanted to establish.
Yeah. So I would say this was the aspiration of Eamon de Valera in the founding of the Republic of Ireland,
Uh-huh.
right? It didn't work out that way.
Mm.
But I think Eamon de Valera and then also Patrick Pierce would be much more leaning in the direction of this should be a Catholic republic,
Hmm.
right? Um, so the Holy Trinity is specifically recognized and professed in the Constitution of Ireland, right?
Uh-huh.
Which is that's putting a marker down, right? That's
Yeah.
that's an interesting claim. Now, you know, water under the bridge, what could have been. But that was the goal. I would also say, no, folks might not like this, sorry, but I would say um, the Islamic Republic of Iran, it would be an example, right?
Uh-huh.
They have a parliament, they have a elected president, um, but they also have a guardian council, right? It's really funny when I totally was a student of philosophy, and he read Plato, right? But the guardian
Yeah.
council is out of the Republic, the sorry, Plato's Republic. But there you have something that's somewhat modern, right? But certainly has a substantial view of things, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Of the good. Um, so you could come up with other ones, but there, what you're looking for is um, you're looking to reinvigorate the good into society, right?
Hmm.
Now, one really important distinction here that I think this helps. When I think about this, where does libertarianism fit in all this, right? This is a particular issue for Americans, right? You know, after World War II, issue like classical liberalism just ceased to exist in Europe, right?
Uh,
As a like individualistic kind of thing, like it was this own individualism. Uh, so, but it's more still active in America, right? That is that view of let's have very small government, limited government, strong emphasis on individual rights, that
yeah.
kind of thing. Um, you see, it's interesting that libertarianism tended to go on the right in America in terms of practical politics.
Hmm.
I personally think libertarianism belongs on the left
Uh,
because it doesn't respect the good in society, right?
right.
Um, so, you know, I would say what counts as the real, like the extreme right, okay?
Hmm.
The extreme right is somebody who wants to use government power to establish the good.
Yeah. All
You
right.
follow
So
what I'm
do we
saying?
have an example of that, like say in something an American audience might readily recognize? Is there a political figure who actually falls in that category?
Like in American history?
Somebody like the average viewer would be familiar with, would recognize right away.
Um, I mean, I think I think of that's a good question. Uh, in American
It's
history, we
interesting to
have
me that
such
you're having difficulty thinking about it because that shows that the way people throw around the term far right may be a little bit
That's
exaggerated.
right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's as prevalent. It's not nearly as prevalent as people think. I think
Uh-huh.
there are some people out there, right? As
Uh-huh.
far as major figures,
That you would
um,
that anybody would recognize.
yeah,
So, okay, so people want to cast Trump as far right or JD Vance as far right.
yeah.
Why don't you cast them? Well, what is it about them that you would say, no, that's not what I mean?
Well, I might distinguish between the two, actually.
Between
Uh,
Trump and Vance. Sure.
yeah.
They're not identical, but
Mm,
what would but you're not putting them on the far right. I mean, so right now in this
uh,
conversation. So I want to know, like, given that lots of people hear they're far right every single day when they turn on the news, why why do you say that's not a correct way to count?
um, well, so let's see here. I think that they still basically are committed to liberal commitments, right? That
Uh-huh.
is, they tend to still think about things in terms of individual rights.
Uh-huh.
They still tend to think about things in uh, um, the sort of equality, right?
Hmm.
To some degree, even though they're accused of being, non-egalitarian or whatever all the time, they still have some fundamental commitments there. Um, Now, I will say that they edge out, though. I mean, I do think that they're on the on the right end of the moderate right, I guess you might say,
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be a
because I do
spectrum.
think that they have a stronger view. They're not libertarian,
Yes.
right,
Right.
at all. And I think Vance is actually probably to the right of Trump.
Yeah, I think that's
Um,
accurate.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think he has a pretty strong view of politics in the state. Um, so, what distinguishes them though is I still think that fundamentally they're going to articulate their arguments in terms of rights, liberty, you
Hmm.
know, freedom, equality, right? When
Yeah, so I
you
don't
have
see in
somebody
either one of these
who's on the
people.
sorry,
So, okay, yeah. Caricatures from the media aside,
uh,
right? I don't when you actually listen to them speak, right? I don't see anything in either of these people that suggests to me that they want to sort of illegalize certain religions or um impose a theocracy or something. I'm not really seeing that.
sure. I mean, I guess the people would see abortion as an issue that's anti-liberal, right?
They would see it as anti-liberal, but so okay. Um, as we already discussed, nobody escapes completely the idea of some
Sure.
good,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And this would be an example of a place where they see some good that's worth enshrining in law. But then so does the left, right? There are goods they see as worth enshrining in law, punishing people for not complying with.
Sure.
So in this case, abortion is one of those things, maybe,
Right. Sure.
although
Yeah.
they're not actually advocating for federal level policies on it.
They're not. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but they're totally okay with individual states
Right.
imposing laws about it, right?
Mhm. Yep. Yeah, and I think Vance might go a little bit further. I think if you were to see like what would a real right politics look like? So let's think about the way these arguments sometimes go. So on the right, the moderate right reacts to certain things on the left by saying, you're trying to shut down free speech,
Uh-huh.
right? And the left responds by saying, no, we're not shutting down free speech, but we do want to shut down hate speech. Hate speech is not free speech.
Right.
Okay.
That's what, yeah.
Now, there's a certain part of the right that says, oh, now we're going to own the libs and show how inconsistent they are, right? Make
Yeah.
jokes, right? And I guess that's fun. But the the thing is, um, that's just being, the moderate liberals, or so the conservatives, or the moderate right, is really just being, that's a liberal argument they're using, essentially. Do you follow me?
Yeah.
Right. Somebody who's on the right might say um, something like, okay, we're gonna so let's take an example. Let's take Russia.
Yeah.
In Russia, it is illegal to promote homosexual uh, homosexual lifestyle to children
Yeah.
because the Russian state sees it to be wrong.
Hmm.
Right? Get the
Right.
different feel?
Yeah. It is a different field. Now, what's interesting is that in the United States, there are plenty of people
Mm,
who advocate politically for not promoting
sure.
LGBTQ agenda, right?
Yeah.
In the schools.
Yeah.
Um, and I would say that for many of those, they hold the view that it is in fact wrong. But I think if you listen to how they'll argue for it politically,
Uh-huh.
they'll actually frame the argument in terms of liberty,
Yeah.
right? And they'll
See, I
say,
think, yeah, on the right, like the strong right, what you say
mhm,
is, we don't allow that because it's wrong, because it's bad, because it's evil, right?
right,
You say like it's not, you don't frame it in terms of individual liberty and equality. You frame it in terms of good and evil, right?
right. So
Like,
so in the American right, right, they're going to say, at least at the political level, what they hold privately is another question, but
right,
at the political level, their argument is going to be constructed by saying, um, they're too young to make those choices. They don't know what they're doing yet. Once they're 18, that's maybe whatever, fine, but at this age, it's inappropriate.
right. Mm,
Um, so what's interesting though is I would say that we probably do have people who would fall on the far right,
mm,
at least in terms of what they believe deep down.
sure.
Right, well, how they'll frame the argument, right? But so
Different
at a
matter.
practical level, they're still operating as liberals, right? Um, so
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think that's correct.
it's a very complicated political landscape, actually.
It is, right. It's sort of it's interesting, when it comes down to the issue then of what makes somebody left. Sometimes people say, well, it's because you're for big government. I don't think that that's correct, right? I think what really distinguishes right and left is their attitude towards the good.
Uh-huh.
And their, sort of issue about, because in other words, one might say I don't like big government and have good arguments for it and be sort of on the right, but I don't think there's anything in principle, right? At least the way I've developed it, right? In having sort of big government that is if it's aligned with the good, like some version of the good and the Aeschylean regime in the way I've tried to describe it, right?
Uh-huh.
So I would take it that Plato is on the right, right?
Uh-huh.
Um, do you see like why I would argue that way?
I think I do. Well, he makes a big deal out of the good, right? There's no question about that. Like the whole point of the Republic, in Book 7 is without the good, you can't actually see anything, right? You can't
That's
have a
right.
conversation with your neighbor if you can't see
Right.
the good.
Right. Yeah. And the philosopher kings rule because they see the good and that they can turn around and communicate it to others.
Uh-huh.
Right. Um, and then the auxiliaries, follow the lead of the philosopher kings. Um, and then the many, follow the laws that are wise and good for them, even if they don't particularly like the laws.
Hmm.
Maybe they'll come to learn to like the laws. But their consent is not required in the Republic. Um, the laws are just because they're wise and because they point to the good,
Hmm.
right? Not because they have the consent of the many. Um, so in any event, I see that would be like Plato's an extreme right guy, in my view.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that opens up though an interesting way of thinking about politics, where we can, and again, I know there's a lot I might agree on this, but where we can talk about right and left in ways that aren't about the size of government, right?
Yeah.
Um, when I listen to local right wing radio, supposedly right wing radio, right?
Hmm.
It's kind of, it's not really that culturally conservative,
No,
right?
no, it's yeah, it's basically it's mostly libertarian, I would
It's
say.
mostly libertarian, maybe a little bit culturally conservative, but I would say it's like, 10% cultural conservatism, 90% libertarianism, right?
Yeah.
Or constitutionalism or something like that, right? Um, and so I kind of think, that I think that those who are on the right, um, well, let me ask you, what do you think about that in sort of Catholic terms? Like,
Yeah.
what's the
Okay, so it's a
Catholic
really interesting
view of
issue.
kind of what we have laid out?
Right. It's a really interesting issue because historically the Catholic Church was pretty down on um, the democratic movement
Right.
in the 19th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
Sure.
Um, and resisted it pretty firmly, right? Until really the we started to get toward the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah. I'd say post
Um,
World War One,
yeah.
you know,
I mean it's interesting how long they sort of
that's
fought that battle. Now to read contemporary Catholic magisterial interventions, it seems as if democracy is a positive value.
mm,
Um, but I don't know how much we can really make out of that. I mean, I think what they're saying is that maybe it's a good thing that the rational capacity of human beings to participate in the pursuit of the public good is something that should be, we should have an environment which makes that possible to do.
right.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Mm,
Um, but and you would, you see in contemporary Catholic magisterial interventions, certainly from the time of the Second Vatican Council
right.
onward, um, more openness to religious liberty, and freedom of speech, okay,
Sure.
than you used to.
Yeah, those authority issues, right?
Yeah. But I still think that it's important to understand why the church would change those stances from the more traditional stances where, error has no rights and
Mm,
that kind of stuff.
yeah.
Um, I think again, it's sort of partly practical,
Mm,
like, it's water under the bridge. We just don't have those political regimes anymore.
correct. Right.
And if we attempt to maintain this stance that we can't have freedom of speech, if everybody actually accepts that, if everybody can accept that there's no freedom, there's not really freedom of religion, well, who's going to be on the short end of that deal? It's actually going to be the Christians and the Catholic Church in particular. So we don't want to promote such an idea in the current environment. So I think
Mm,
that's at the very bare minimum, that's I think part of the concession that the Catholic Church has made on that point.
mm,
The other is that going back to the time of the Council of Nicaea, there was this idea that it's really not a good idea to proselytize by the sword. So you could see actually from ancient times that some degree of liberty of conscience was recognized. Now, to what degree it should be politically enshrined is a separate thing,
Mm.
but the church was never really keen on the idea of like, uh, I mean, practices in distinct time frames and specific cultures aside, the official stance of the church that we find in magisterial interventions doesn't really promote proselytism by the sword.
Mm. Forced.
Um,
So does it spell out what you mean exactly? You mean forced conversion?
yeah, forced conversion. Um, no, I know in individual places you do see that, but
Yeah,
I mean it's
but
condemned
I would
most
say,
generally.
the burning of sorry, the execution of heretics is not the same thing.
That's right. No, and leaving, without sort of getting
Getting
into
into
a
it too
discussion
much.
of whether burning heretics is a good thing
Right,
to
of
do or not,
course. Right.
I uh, it is a different thing.
Yeah.
Okay, it is a different thing. So, it's different to say that you have to be faithful to the church in order
Mm.
to be entrusted with political rule, right?
Right, right, right,
Than to say that you have to die if you're not a Catholic.
right.
Um,
Yes,
right? Those are two very, very different kinds of assertions.
I understand.
So anyway, the church's position has kind of, I want to say, kind of migrated, right,
Hmm.
vis-a-vis these questions over the centuries. Um, and it's hard to provide a clear answer, right,
Sure.
about what the Catholic view is. But I would say this.
Okay.
One thing I think we can't escape, no matter how we assess um, pragmatic political questions like
Hmm.
what sort of space do we leave for religious dissent or religious diversity?
Hmm.
That's always been sort of a live discussion point within the history of the church, and different judgments are made at different times in different places, right, about how much
Okay.
latitude to allow that. But I would say that the enduring dogmatic center of that whole discussion is the idea that there is, in fact, a truth in religion. There's a good, there's something true, right?
Hmm.
And it's good for souls, therefore good for society. Um,
True. Yeah.
okay, so I would say that really Catholicism is going to have to come down on the right more than on the left.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be hard to see how you could be. The question I was going to try to ask you is how, like, given the way I've defined the terms, right?
Yeah, right. In this
Um,
discussion, right.
the I don't see how a Catholic could be on the far left.
No, I would say that's absolutely impossible, right? Because you want to undermine tradition itself. You
Yeah,
want to
right.
undermine the idea of a good around which we cohere.
Sure. Yeah. As Marx put it, all philosophers, this isn't true, but all philosophers hate gods, right?
Right,
And
right. Well, if
like
that's your view, okay.
like I said, right? If you're just fundamentally anti-metaphysical, anti-religious, um, you know, and so egalitarian, right? Sort of that you're like on board with the sexual revolution and all that stuff. I mean, I see all of that as part of the revolutionary left, right? The strong, real revolutionary left.
Yeah,
Um, Now,
that's
maybe
it.
you can make some
You
arguments
can't.
about the more moderate left. I'm not sure,
Uh,
that maybe just we want to have proceduralism and keep religion out of the square or
right.
minimized.
So there, I mean, obviously, you and I both know that there are endless discussions about these things, right?
Sure.
Especially during the 20th century, there've been lots of discussions about what kind of political system would be good from a Catholic point of view in the modern context.
Right.
Um, and then, there are those, right, who sort of thought the American political framework provides a pretty good space
Mhm.
for the church. And then there are those sort of in the communio wing, right, who are like, well, not really. It's kind of fundamentally incompatible.
Mm,
ultimately with, for some of the reasons that you were discussing, right?
sure.
That basically it starts from a basically libertarian premise.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Um, and and I guess for me personally, I sort of get both sides of that argument, right?
Mm,
But the way I come at it is that we live in a fallen world
hmm.
and we live in a specific time.
Sure.
Okay, so I can't change that fact. I can't go back to the
Right.
Middle Ages.
Right.
Um, there are reasons one might want to, and there are lots of other reasons why one would not want to, not least of which is the lack of antibiotics.
Yeah.
Okay,
Modern germ theory.
right. I mean, like, there are downsides to the Middle Ages, no matter what your ideological perspective might be.
Sure.
Um, we can't do that, nor can
Mm,
we sort of accelerate into some unknown future. We live now, right? It's here in this context that we have to try to work out the most Catholic compatible framework
mm,
that's politically achievable. Okay. And the way I see it, the constitutional framework of the United States is not a terrible solution if we could be consistent with it. And by that, I mean, at least the First Amendment, as traditionally understood,
mm,
um, and I'll say, you know, not at the time of the founding, but once it was extended to the state level, let's say, okay, um, which is a later interpretation, as you know. I would say that that at least provides a framework within which the truth of the gospel could be publicly proclaimed, um, and has a chance to influence the political agenda. Okay, so in other words, we can witness to the good.
mm.
Now, other people can too, and they may disagree with us,
Sure.
but we're given space in the political arena within which we can voice our concerns, make our arguments, try to
Mm,
persuade people, and influence legislation thereby.
mm,
Now, that kind of sounds maybe a little bit further to the right on your scale,
mm,
um, but I think the U.S. Constitution provides a framework for that,
mm.
which to me, in the contemporary context, would be a win from
Sure.
a Catholic point of view. It
Right.
may not be the ideal Catholic state,
Mm.
but I think it's at least like we could live in such an environment.
Yeah. 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 That's fair. I think that's fair. Um, what if one just hypothetically found oneself in a what I've defined as a far right regime?
Well, you'd better hope it was one that was like your idea of the good,
Mhm.
right?
Could a
Because like,
Catholic be like accept such a thing and you know
should a Catholic accept such a thing?
yeah,
Well, I
like
think
if
if
he
it was a
found himself within such a regime,
yeah.
right?
Historically, the answer to that question is yes, right? I mean, like
Seems to me.
the church thought those things were good in the past.
Mm,
Um, so take a look at, Hungary right now.
mm.
Okay, I would say that that's pushing more in the direction of far right.
Yeah, I would agree.
Um, but the morality that's being promoted, at least I'm not a scholar on the thing, so maybe I'm wrong about stuff. But from what I read about,
Right.
the morality that's being promoted by Orban,
Hmm.
um, yes, he's enforcing it through law in certain ways, right?
Mm,
Certain things are illegal there, and that would be
mm,
legal here.
sure.
Certain things are promoted here that are suppressed there.
Right.
Um, and the tax laws favor big families, et cetera,
Right.
right?
Mm,
So he's promoting a culture of life that way.
yeah.
Um, Marriage, family, okay.
Mm,
Yeah, that's far right, I guess, according to your definition.
mm,
There's definitely a vision of the good,
that's right.
but
Yeah.
it's a Judeo-Christian understanding of it, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, I think that's right. Yeah.
And so yeah, that's probably fine.
Okay. Interesting. That's cool. Good.
I mean, we'll probably get some flames for that, I guess.
I mean, it seems to be correct. I think you're correct. I mean, my own sympathies are in that direction. I don't have a lot of, uh, I think what you've said on behalf of sort of a moderate right is correct. And I think one can make a case for the moderate right, and that's fine. And I think under some circumstances that can work. Um, and it's better than a lot of alternatives,
Yeah.
So
The downside to the far right, all right. So I'm going to say this.
hmm.
I mean, obviously, if you're on the far left, then the downside to the far right is that it's the far right, period.
Right, its
Okay.
existence, right?
Um, but from my point of view as a Catholic,
Hmm.
okay, uh, the downside to the far right as a governing model is that if you don't share that view of things,
Hmm.
then you don't really belong in the society,
Correct.
and
At best,
and
you'll be tolerated,
you
maybe.
might be tolerated.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
you could see people going so far right that you wouldn't be tolerated at all.
Mhm.
Right? You could be expelled, right?
Sure.
Um,
Exile.
yeah.
Mhm.
And we've seen that historically happen, right?
Sure.
Certainly in the Islamic regimes, right? You often see that people are radically marginalized within society, if not openly persecuted, and
Mhm.
like it's so hard to be, it's so hard to hold a different view that your life is in danger.
Mhm. Sure.
Well, I don't, I'm not, like, let me put it, I'm not comfortable with that. Okay.
Well, yeah. So here's the thing: is do you want to critique that though from the perspective of a liberal framework, or do you want to critique it because it's a false religion?
Yeah. So if you're
It-
asking me
it's-
personally,
uh,
um, I, my first move is to critique it because it's a false religion. My, so yeah, I guess I'm pretty far right. But but I'm also, if politics is the art of the practical,
it's going to be often.
then
Yeah.
then I recognize that like in the current situation, right? Um, we're not really close to any of that
Mhm.
in the United States. That's not
Sure.
even on the table.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And there's no, it would be absurd to attempt to put it on the table in this context.
I agree.
Um, so I will make liberal arguments for it, I guess,
Are
uh,
those? Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that these liberal arguments feel ad hoc, and that's okay. I don't mind. Like I think
in
as a
politics, sometimes you
rhetorician,
have to do.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You could make that, but it's not a strong philosophical commitment
Yeah. Right.
to liberalism.
It's not that I think it's fundamental. So look, here's the thing. Deep down, I do agree that error has no rights.
Mhm.
Um, I think that people have rights. And I think that people who are in error have certain rights to, not be abused because of their error. So I would strongly oppose, let me put it this way, I would strongly oppose on principle, um, persecution of minority religious groups.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I would strongly oppose that on principle because I think it's abusive to the human person. Um, However, I still think that certain if a society, the ideal society, in my view, would have religious commitments
Mhm.
to the true religion.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sure.
I'm speaking as a Catholic, right? I'm not.
Right.
So, now is that practically possible in the United States? In the broadest possible terms, maybe. I mean, you see it reflected in the founding documents, right? Where they do talk about God in the founding documents. They take certain things for granted about the broad Judeo-Christian worldview.
Mhm.
Um, I would promote that. I think actually when you pull the plug on that, like that's the Jenga piece, right? That kind of makes tower collapse.
Uh,
So I think we gotta try to maybe put that back. But I
mm,
don't know if in the current, I don't think we could go much further than that at a practical level in the United
I
States.
tend to agree. It will be interesting to see. We should probably wrap up after this, but we, you know, if particularly the United States, the country continues to fragment.
Uh-huh.
I've seen a number of pretty good commentators argue as a matter of description and analysis, not prescription, but just
Hmm.
as a matter of this is what I think is going to happen, right? Argue for this the decline of the United States in terms of economics, right? Technology and competence
Hmm.
to such a degree that decentralization just begins to happen,
Uh-huh.
right? Um, and the state, without sort of any strong political moves, the states just become more and more self-governing
Hmm.
um, because of the just general decline of the central institutions of the country,
Hmm.
the centralizing institutions of the country, I should
Hmm.
say, right? Um, and if that were the case, right, one might imagine, right, you know, some localities, you know, being able to put together a more substantive politics than others,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, I think that's right. So you might, and you would find people then, I think actually you see the signs of this already, right? People, we're seeing interesting patterns of migration within the United States,
Yes, we
right?
are.
Where conservative people, conservative, okay, are moving to conservative states, right? Um, and people on the left are moving to leftist states.
Hmm.
Um, it's very interesting because you would have thought, say 20 years ago, if you had a large wave of migration from a blue state to a red state, you would see that red state start to turn purple.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, we don't see that pattern right now. The that pattern seems to have kind of reversed itself,
Mm-hmm.
and the red states are getting redder with migration, and the blue states are getting bluer.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah, that's true.
So you've got people selecting, right, for the kind of world they want to live in, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's a solution that at least, and again, at a practical level, maybe that's a solution we could kind of live with.
Yeah, that's what, you know, there's um, there's a, is it Brian, was it Brian McClanahan? Uh, he's a historian and political commentator. And he's a strong, like very, 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 very strong in principle on federalism side, right, of things. But he also makes this practical argument, right, that a lot of our national issues might go away if we, or at least the temperature on them would be turned way down
Hmm.
if people just accepted that the states were more independent,
Yeah.
right? You know, than we tend to think, right? So that we may not like the California has abortions, and we may want to persuade them otherwise, but that the solution to those sorts of arguments, right, is that the states that want to not have abortion will not have abortion, right, and the states that want to have it will have it, and that fits more with thinking of them as a union of this country as a union of states rather than a national democracy.
Yeah. At a practical level, once again, I do kind of think that, look, it's you got your head in the sand if you think that we're not at a crisis point
Mhm.
uh, in this country in terms of cohesion. All
Right.
right. And so you ask yourself, so what available solutions are there? And some of those solutions just don't seem at all realistic. But that one sort of does to me, right? In terms of at least like not descending into civil war or something, right? Um,
Right.
you can learn to live next to each other.
Mm,
Okay. The states can learn to live, to be neighbors
mm,
with each other, if they can see themselves as distinct states unified around, um, broad international agreements or something.
sure.
Um, but, and compacts of protection and that sort of stuff. But whether we can sell that or not, I don't know.
Mm,
Will it just practically happen? Maybe. But there are a lot of people out there, I think, particularly on the left, who have a proselytic attitude toward the leftist version of the good.
hmm
And they don't they just I'm not sure they will tolerate there being states on the right.
hmm
That's one of, I mean, it's what I see. I don't know if it's correct or not, but
Yeah.
it's what it looks like to me.
Mm.
Anyway,
It's fair, I think. We'll see.
yeah,
As they say, we live in interesting times.
right. Well, this is a good conversation. Really interesting, and I think it's important to get at the complexity of the issue.
Mm,
Um, in the Catholic tradition, we have prided ourselves in a good way, I guess, on a commitment to you know, dialogue around the truth, right?
hmm
In the Catholic tradition, we've prided ourselves on understanding the interlocutor and correctly characterizing issues
Yes, yeah.
and addressing them on their own terms. And so I think it's really helpful, right, to try to frame this issue in a way that helps the audience to avoid the caricatures and cut through the propaganda and the polemics that we find
Yeah.
in the dialogue, from the sources they're used to. So,
Yeah.
thanks for a great conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and to the audience, thanks for listening. I hope you found it helpful, and God bless.